Hey y'all, I'm Jess Rowe from Jess Rowe Health and Fitness, and today we are talking about how to strengthen your weak wrists. So if your wrists get stiff, tired, or sore after doing exercises on your hands and knees, or any exercise really, especially yoga where you spend a lot of time on that weight-bearing hands, then you're probably going to benefit from this. So if you want to strengthen your wrists so that you can do more yoga, so you can do more handstands or just balancing on your hands, you can also want to improve your wrist strength to boost your workout performance. So the amount of weight that you can lift is actually going to be limited by the strength of your wrists and your grip strength. So that can be really beneficial for improving wrist strength. This video is going to teach you a few new wrist stretches and exercises that you can do, and I'm going to go over 2 of the keys for getting your wrists into a good alignment for any exercise that you want to do on your hands. So we're going to talk about the positioning as well as how you want to place pressure on your hands. So we're going to go over those today. Now, as a society, we don't do a lot to keep our wrists strong. In fact, most of what we do each day is actually contributing to weaker wrists. So spending time with the computer, smartphone, tablet, at work, when we do a lot of repetitive motions, just these little fine motor skills. These are great where you're using your fingers to do cool things, making crafts, playing video games, whatever you could want to create with your hands. It's all fine motor skills. But unfortunately, that doesn't do a whole lot to strengthen the actual wrist. So when you spend all day doing fine motor skills that don't actually strengthen the wrist, this can make it really hard when you are ready to go to the gym or do a workout class and your wrists just aren't up to the task. So a lot of times you might find that you could probably have done more in a workout, but your wrists just couldn't keep going, and that can be incredibly frustrating. So today, let's start fixing those weak wrists. So we're going to be working more on the bigger wrist motion. So we're going to be talking about muscles that cross your arm, your forearm here, and into your hand. So you'll still be using your fingers. Fingers are still critical for this part, but you're going to be practicing some things that will hopefully do a little reversing of the wrist weakening that tends to happen when you spend all day, every day at the computer or just doing fine motor skills as opposed to larger body movements. So let's get started. So your wrists are home to a lot of different connective tissues. In your wrist, you're going to have all of the bones. It's quite a few bones that actually make up the wrist, plus the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments, the nerves, the blood vessels, and a few other types of connective tissues that all help it all hold together in one little bitty wrist. So it's a lot to try to squeeze into a small space. So that's why getting your hand positioning is going to be super important, because if you aren't careful about how you're positioning your hands, it can turn into a huge amount of force and pressure that you are placing on one small little joint of your body. And so this can, of course, result in pinched nerves, tendonitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, and any other painful injury you can think of. So to prevent that and avoid that and potentially even fix it, though always make sure you are seeing a doctor if you are currently having pain or dysfunction. So I am not here for diagnosing anything, so make sure you see a doctor. But if you are asking your hands and wrists to support any amount of your body weight, you want to pay attention to how you're placing them so that they can support that load safely and effectively, and I'm going to show you how. Now, when you're placing your hands to be able to support your body weight, you want to pay attention to how they are arranged. You want your hands to be spread wide. Those fingers are a base of support for you. And while you're not putting all your weight on your fingertips, they're still going to help the wider they're spread apart. So, now obviously stay within a comfortable range. You don't need to stretch super far. Just something comfortable that gives you a wide base of support. So next, you want to make sure that your pointer finger here is pointing straight forward. So your hands, a lot of people will place their hands like this, which is how you'd place your hand maybe if you're going to like trace it or something. But you'll notice here at my wrist is now turned, so it's pointing inward. And so when I go to put more pressure on my hand and my wrist, that's going to mean that I put pressure in some odd places. But if I turn my hand so that pointer finger is pointing straight forward, it makes my wrist crease, you can see where my skin creases, that wrist crease is now parallel to the lines on the floor. And that's where you want the wrist creases to be parallel with each other, where you could draw a straight line from one wrist crease to the other, as opposed to your wrist creases creating a weird angle. So pointer finger should point forward, wrist crease should be straight and pointing straight forward, and your fingers should be spread wide apart for a wide base of support. And that will give you a much better positioning, so that you won't find as much pinching or pressure landing on your wrists. Now let's talk about the pressure and how you want to put pressure onto your hands when you are putting more weight onto your hands and wrists. So your wrist should not carry all of the weight. Your hand, partly in how it's positioned, should bear some of the weight. It should really be split fairly evenly between your hand and your wrist. So the tricks here are, you want to make sure that you are pushing down through the pointer finger mound. So right where that finger connects to the palm of your hand, you're going to be putting pressure there, but you also want to make sure pressure is going into this baby finger over here and that mound. And then you'll also have pressure going into the mound of your thumb as well as the thumb itself. So that creates a nice tripod, which really gives your hands and wrists a really strong base of support. Now you're also going to be pressing lightly with your fingertips. You just won't get as much pressure in these middle two fingers, that middle finger and the ring finger. Not as much pressure will land in there, but they're still bearing some of that weight to help support you. So next, you'll want to make sure that your wrist is not collapsing down into the ground or into the mat. You don't want all of your weight going in there. You'll especially notice that when people even start bringing their fingers up off of the mat or even locking out their elbows. That's when a lot of the weight goes straight into that wrist joint. So the wrist should be in contact with the ground, but the final key here is to think of your palm as a suction cup. And you're actually going to imagine that it's drawing up off of the ground, and that'll help give you some lift through that wrist and take a little of the intense pressure off of the wrist, as well as help you shift the pressure and weight into the pointer finger mound, the little finger mound, and the thumb. So your palm will still mostly stay in contact with the ground, but when you can visualize it being a suction cup and really lifting up off of the mat and helping create that big base of support, you'll notice a huge difference in how your hands and wrists feel and how much you're able to do. Now, focusing just on the positioning and the pressure of your hands when you're doing any mat work is going to go a long way towards strengthening up those wrists. So if you have patience over time, as you're just very conscious of that and keep practicing and pushing yourself a little bit more each time, your wrists will get stronger on their own. You won't really necessarily have to do anything extra, but of course, if we're talking about wanting to strengthen up your hands and wrists quickly so you can start seeing more benefits, there are a few things you can do. So first, you want to just start by warming up those wrists. So you can just do some wrist circles, which are really nice. And just make sure you go in both directions. So you can do that just until you feel a slight warmth in the wrists. Once you're there, and you can also actually do it with your hands stretched, you can play with your fingers, just whatever you need to get some blood flowing through those hands. So once you're there, you're going to start moving through the different ranges of motion that your wrists can do. So it's primarily going to be your wrist flexion, your wrist extension, And the lateral movement is also called radial deviation when you go side to side. And then squeezing. So those are the main ones we're going to look at today because I want to keep it as simple as possible for you. So these are all stretches and exercises you could do every single day if you felt the need, or just make it a point to do it, say like right before and right after a workout, or even just right before or right after. But when you do it regularly, you will start to really see some improvements. So to do the active stretch on wrist flexion, you're going to simply start with your hand nice and straight, keep your fingers nice and straight, and you're going to flex your wrist as far as you can. And that's it. You can bring it back to start and flex. So you're actually using the muscles here in your forearm to do this. And then you can do an alternative, which is going to be curling your fingers and then extend. And then curl them and bring them back, and that's going to help work on the grip strength, like we just talked about. For the passive stretch on wrist flexion, you're going to do this exact same motion, keeping your fingers nice and straight. You're going to straighten out your arm, and then just use your other hand to gently stretch your hand towards your arm. Keep your fingers straight, and that will keep you from overstretching your wrist, and you should just feel a nice stretch right through that forearm. And on the passive stretch, since this one is mostly for stretching these tight muscles, you can kind of play with the angle here as long as it doesn't hurt your wrist, and see if you feel tightness in any other areas of this forearm, because there's quite a few muscles in there that might need to get stretched. So that's the active stretch for wrist flexion. For the strength of wrist flexion, you could have a small, say 1 to 3 pound weight. You could even use a can of beans or like a small can of soup. Any of those 15-ounce cans you can get at the grocery store work great. It's the exact right amount of weight for these little muscles here in the forearm. So all you would do is hold the weight. I don't have any lighter ones I can show you with, and personally I just like to do this with just my hands. So you will curl those fingers around whatever weight you're using and then flex it towards you. So you could do this on a table with the table supporting your hand, and then you would let your hand hang down, curl those fingers, bring it up as high as you can. You'll really feel it through that forearm working, and then slowly release back down. You could let the weight roll forward if you have a little weight, and then catch it with those fingers to really work on that grip strength and bring it back up. And that is how to do the strength exercise for wrist flexion. Now for the active stretch for wrist extension, again, you're just actively moving your wrist into that range of motion. So you're extending your wrist this time. You're using that backside of your arm here. And you're simply going to keep your fingers straight and stretch it back as far as you can go. You'll feel those muscles working. You might feel some stretch here if you're tight. And then you can come back up to start. You can do the variation of curling your fingers and stretching back, and then coming back up. Personally, I don't find that one does a whole lot for me, but you could be weak in ways that I am not, or I could be weak in ways that you're not. So simply actively take your hand through its full range of motion without creating any pain. And that is wrist extension active stretch. For the wrist extension passive stretch, you're doing the exact same thing, except you're going to use your other hand to passively pull that hand back as though you're pulling your fingers, the back of your hand towards your arm. So just get a nice little stretch here. You'll feel it stretch through here. And there you go. And please excuse my hyperextending elbows there. So that is the passive stretch for wrist extension. Now, finally, we're going to do the strength for wrist extension. It's going to be exactly like your strength for the wrist flexion, except of course moving in the opposite direction. So if you were holding a weight, you could prop your hand on the table or on your leg. You just want something supporting your hand, and you'll hold that weight. You can let it drop down, And then slowly bring it up as high as you can without any pinching, and bring it back down. And again, if you really want to add in a little grip strength component, you can hook that weight in your fingers and then pull it up and let it come down. Let the weight pull those fingers down so you're really working those finger muscles, and come back up. And that is how you would do some strength training for your wrist extension. Now for the other motion that your wrists can do, and it's a very small range of motion, you'll notice, but your wrist can turn to each side, like that. And it's a smaller range going this way. It's a little harder, it kind of pinches there for me. So this one is called lateral deviation, not that it matters, but if you want to do the active stretch, it's exactly how I just showed you. You simply keep those fingers straight and then actively move through your full range of motion as much as you can. You could stabilize your elbow with your other hand if you want to, and then just turn back and forth. So you'll notice some stretching and some gentle tightening and strengthening as you do this. So that's how you would do the active stretch. This one, you don't really do a passive stretch. You'll get enough passive stretching if you have the tight forearm muscles. You'll get enough stretching from doing the wrist flexion and extension. So there's no passive stretch for the lateral wrist movement. Finally, if you want to strengthen it, again, simply doing that active stretch where you move through your full range of motion, you're going to strengthen a lot that way. If you feel like you need more strength, again, you can hold a dumbbell in your hand. This one's actually really well done if you have a hammer, because the hammer holds the weight way out here, and so your hand will really have to work to move that weight. And that's all you would do there, is either hold a weight or a hammer and do that same motion. That's how you would do your strengthening for the lateral wrist movement. And finally, we have the grip strength boost exercise. So that's going to be a ball squeeze. So if you don't have a ball, you could just practice squeezing your fist. Squeeze gently and release. You want to be really careful if you're doing a closed fist that you don't squeeze too hard, or you will get pinching, the nasty pinching sensation in either fingers, wrist, wherever. So having a ball is ideal. You could have any kind of ball. You just want it to give a little bit. So this is a stress ball I found, which is lovely. So you can pick up stress balls, or if you have any other kind of ball rolling around your house, if you have kids. You could probably even use a plastic ball because it'll resist you, and that'll just be an isometric exercise. So if you have a ball, you'll just hold on to it and squeeze. So you can play with how much you squeeze. You could imagine doing different degrees of squeezing. So you can squeeze soft, medium, hard, kind of like that, and then practice releasing it too. So if you squeeze soft, medium, and hard, then release to medium and soft, and then release. So that's a good control test for you to see how well you can control that. You can play with how smoothly you can squeeze. The release seems to be a lot harder for me. But playing with this, you can also do counting. You could count, say, to 5, count to 10, whatever you feel like you can handle, and then release. And then just make sure after you do this that you do a little bit of passive stretching to just loosen up that hand and wrist, because these little forearm muscles will get tired. So use the ball squeeze if you are wanting to improve your grip strength even more. All right, guys, so there are, of course, loads of other exercises. There's some really cool ones out there if you want to get into like the physical therapy variety of stuff. But there's lots of other ways you can stretch and strengthen your wrists. But for today, we're keeping it simple. I want you to be able to just add this into your normal routine each day. It should only take a few minutes. That way, if you are struggling with wrist strength or weak wrist issues, this should help you overcome those really quickly, especially if you're doing them a little bit each day. So let me know in the comments if this was helpful for you, and I will be seeing you soon. Have a great day.